The new Ontario government's action-packed legislative agenda yielded strong reactions from all corners of the provincial and political landscape. Here to debrief on what you might have missed over the summer, Melissa Lantzman. She is Vice President Public Affairs at Hill & Knowlton Strategies and head of Doug Ford's War Room during the June election. Brad Levine, Principal and Vice President at Council Public Affairs, former strategic advisor to the Ontario NDP's 2018 campaign. David Hurley, Principal Partner at the Gandalf Group, Managing Co-Chair of the Ontario Liberal Party election campaign, and Stacey Dankert, the Green Party of Ontario's finance critic and the party's candidate in Kitchener Centre in the last election. And I am delighted to welcome all of you around our table here. First time for you. First time for you. First time in a long time. First time in a long time for you. You're the veteran at this table, Stacey. There we go. Anyway, happy day after Labor Day. Happy beginning of our 13th season to everybody here. Let's start with a nice, easy question. Doug Ford's been Premier for 67 days. New PC government's been in place for 67 days. Melissa, how are they doing?
It's been a long 67 days. Look, I think he hit the ground running really quickly. I think he got a lot of the election promises, at least the easy ones, out of the way. York University strike, killing the carbon tax, firing the CEO and the head of the board of Hydro One. Those are the really simple things that he got off the table first. So he was able to say promise made, promise kept. And I think as we go forward, this is going to be the tough stuff.
Brad, how would you gauge it?
Well, I agree with Melissa that it's been a long 67 days. For progressives in this province, what we're seeing is the fundamental difference that Doug Ford, with his majority, is ushering in. I will take exception, though. A lot of the things that Mr. Ford has done have not been promises made, promises kept. In particular, the pilot project on the basic income, he did actually promise that he would keep it going, and he did not. And he's fallen back on a couple of other promises. So if this government's public relations is going to be promises made, promises kept, they can't be selective, because they have done a number of things that they did not promise, and in fact, in other cases, the opposite.
David.
You know, I hear what Brad's saying about that, but to be honest, the way I look at it is I don't think that Ford has done anything that anybody watching him wouldn't have expected him to do or shouldn't have counted on him to do, even something like the basic income pilot. I mean, who really thought that a basic income was part of Doug Ford's worldview? So
it may not have been part of his worldview, but the woman sitting beside you said they were going to keep it, and so did the woman who's now the deputy premier of the province.
But it doesn't surprise me that they're not, and it won't surprise me when the Greenbelt is developed either, because you have to look at what people overall stand for and what they're about, and that's where he's at. I think that Melissa's right in that he's knocked off, in terms of his promises, some of the lowest hanging fruit. But the real hard work is yet to come when they produce a budget and we see a fiscal plan, because they've got a promise to eliminate the deficit. Corey tonight told me on my podcast that they're going to use the Auditor General's numbers in doing that. They are...
Which, just so people understand, will make it harder to balance the books.
By several billion dollars.
Yes.
By several billion dollars. And, they are intent on finding ways to reduce revenue to the government, and they've promised to lower taxes yet. So this is all going to come to a head, and we're going to end up in a much bigger fights than we've had in the first 67 days of this government about the inevitable service cuts that happen.
So I agree with David that a lot of the changes that we've been seeing are not things that we couldn't have anticipated based on the election. The thing that really concerns me is that we seem to be seeing a lot of cutting without a lot of planning in terms of, how are we going to meet our climate goals? How are we going to deal with issues surrounding poverty? So I think that it's really important that we not just cut programs without having a plan in place to replace it.
The mantra was promise made, promise kept. We have heard that dozens and dozens of times from PC cabinet ministers and backbenchers in the legislature when they give speeches and make announcements and so on. How accurate is that, in fact?
Look, I think that during the campaign, and you probably would agree, that Ford tapped into an anger that was, I'm working harder, I'm not getting ahead. And these promises, again, are the low-hanging fruit. They are the things that put money directly back into the taxpayer's pocket. And that's really who he's accountable to. He doesn't owe anything to anyone. Nobody supported him during his leadership. Frankly, the party establishment wasn't even behind him. So he really sees his accountability to the people. And the people have spoken for tax cuts and making life a little bit easier.
Here's what David Reevely wrote in the Ottawa Citizen I guess a month and change ago. Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? Populism opposes whatever burdens the vile elites have imposed on normal, decent people. It doesn't offer much guidance for what ought to replace those things. What's a populist environmental policy? What's a populist policy on welfare? The Tories have been on a real streak in their first month, fulfilling a meaningful percentage of their promises to take things down. That's what they were elected to do, and they're doing it, so good for them. What comes next? Nobody really knows, apparently, including the Tories. Is that accurate?
I think so. I think there's a couple of good points in there. One is that it is easier to dismantle your previous government's efforts than it is to build. The big challenges that they're setting up, that the Ford government is setting up, is, and it goes to what David was speaking about, when we take a look at their fiscal, to get all of those things, tax cuts, balanced budget, nobody fired. We've already seen some.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah, but again, if promises made, promises kept, and they're not keeping those promises, that's a bit of it cuts the underlying premise of the government. The other thing is on the climate plan. Both Mr. Scheer in Ottawa, as well as Mr. Ford here in Ontario, have promised to, they've gotten rid of the carbon pricing, the cap and trade, and promised to replace it with something that is going to recognize the need to cut carbon emissions. What those plans are is the big homework coming up in the next handful of months. I think that things are going to get a lot harder in Ontario. If you take a look at the economy, where it's going, what we're seeing out of the United States, the tariffs on steel and aluminum, the challenges that we're having with NAFTA, the uncertainty that's coming with all that we see coming out of the White House, it's going to be some tough economic times. There are going to be some very difficult decisions for the Ford government to make, and things are going to get harder for a lot of people.
Can I just follow up with you on that, Melissa? How queasy is the party feeling about the fact that it killed cap and trade, as it said it was going to do, but has not replaced it with anything yet, and has sort of been, it's coming soon. It's coming soon. That's what we hear.
Yeah, look, I think Brad's right that they have a lot of decisions to make ahead of themselves, both on plans on specifically about the climate, but on everything else. You're going to have to get to look. Any government that comes in is going to say the cupboards are bare. The situation is worse than we ever thought. Between the Auditor General's numbers, between the lofty promises during the election, and that's not only tax cuts, that's a 75% back on childcare. Those cost another, I would say $5 billion. So we're now looking at really big deficit numbers. Hydro, that's a problem that you know well for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that to get to that number in a 4-year term to balance the budget, a lot of tough decisions. So I think you're going to see the government signaling a lot of efficiencies and call them what you want, cuts. And getting there is going to be very difficult for them.
David, I will follow up on that in a second, but I just want to refocus for a second to look at the Liberals, because we are sort of in an unprecedented moment here in Ontario political history, certainly for our lifetimes anyway, in as much as the government that has just been replaced is not an officially recognized party in the Ontario legislature, which means it kind of doesn't have a voice to defend what it did officially at Queen's Park, and the new government is basically replacing so much of what the old government did without any kind of official feedback from the old government. How tough is it for the Liberals to sort of be meaningful under these circumstances?
Well, I think that you could have ended that with a few different questions, and you ended it with the toughest one. It's difficult to be relevant with 7 members in the legislature and not having party status. In terms of the response to the dismantling of the government's agenda, first of all, I've been pleasantly surprised by the enthusiasm with which the NDP have been defending the previous government's agenda. And I'm also pleased by the popular outrising that one sees on social media and other places to defend at least some of the programs, basic income and some of the other things that the government had put in place, somewhat distinguishing the unpopularity of that government from the popularity of a number of the initiatives that it had taken. If there's a silver lining for the Liberals in all of this, it's that they aren't there having to defend the past every day. And they don't have that burden of being locked into what they did. And there is an opportunity to rethink without having the responsibility day in and day out in the House, in the legislature, to dig yourself in defending what you did in the past. Gives you a chance to think about the future.
Although the member for Don Valley West is in her seat and kind of a daily reminder, certainly for the other 6, that the previous leader and premier, who, let's face it, got us into some of this kind of trouble, is there. Is it hard to turn the page when Kathleen Wynne's still in the legislature?
I don't think so. I think that she's got very good relationships with all those other members, and she knows what her role is now, which is to step back and let other people emerge to lead the party. So she's not trying to direct things in there anymore.
Let me follow up on something you said with Brad. It has been interesting to see the NDP defend the previous government's position on sex ed, for example, defend the previous government's position on green energy, for example, and you can make a longer list as you wanted to go along as well. Does that put the official opposition in an awkward place in this legislature?
No, I don't believe so, because some of these issues, there was agreement. We can debate how that was done, how it was implemented, and kind of look around the margins on implementation. But by and large, increasing the minimum wage is a good thing. Having a price on carbon that reduces emissions effectively is a good thing. So the party will stand up and say, these are good things that Doug Ford is dismantling. I think the most exciting aspect of the next handful of years will be, can Andrea Horwath and the New Democratic Party capture that center, in addition to the left, can it capture that non-conservative vote to push back the Liberals so that they don't come back and establish a two-party, predominantly two-party, recognizing the Greens, of course, have won their seat, predominantly two-party system as we have in other provinces. That'll be very interesting. It's not going to be easy. And we don't have precedent in this province for it, but it'll be an interesting challenge, and I know one that Ms. Horwath and the team are seized with.
And let me follow up on something you just said. That is certainly one of the things that makes this parliament historic, is that for the first time ever, there's a Green MPP there, your leader, Mike Schreiner, who got elected.
Yes.
What kind of a difference can one person out of 124 make?
Well, he was already making a huge difference before he won a seat. He was able to have positive effect on the discussions about electoral finance reform and those types of things. And I think that can just be furthered now that he has a voice within Queen's Park. He's been, one of the things that I love that he's been doing is every time he votes, he tweets about what he voted and why he held that position. And I think that bringing that type of transparency to Queen's Park alone can have a flow-on effect that I'm hoping will take place across the board.
Okay, back to the government. One of the questions I get asked a lot, and therefore I want to put it to you, is who's actually making the decisions in this government? And I'll give you a bit of a checklist, and maybe you can help us sort of understand how it works.
Try.
I mean, obviously there is the Premier, but the Premier has an influential chief of staff who has very little political experience, but a lot of Doug Ford experience. He has a principal secretary who has not that much Doug Ford experience, but a lot of political experience. And then, of course, there's the cabinet and the caucus after that. Peel back the curtain. How does it work?
Look, I think he's assembled a strong team of sort of mixed talent. MPPs that have been there for a long time, that know how the place works, and that was a nod to them. You were here. Now you get to take these positions of real decision making. I think within his office, he's got multiple verticals of influence, those with a lot of political experience, those with a lot of Ford experience, and I think that it's working well. Right now, I think we're seeing a lot of the decisions, as you would in any government early on, come from a very sort of centralized place, and as people get briefed up, look, they sat 12 days after forming government. Getting their ducks in a row for a question period, that doesn't give you a lot of time to brief up on your files. But if they're taking the next 3 weeks to brief up on their files, I think you'll see a lot of that decision making decentralized back into ministers' responsibility and with a strong team around them.
How does it look to you?
It looks like an extreme version of most provincial governments. Most provincial governments are run by a handful of people, some ministers, some staff. In the Premier's office. And this is, I think, an extreme version of that. I know that there were Conservatives who didn't like Mr. Ford, who reassured people, listen, the Caroline Mulrooney's and the Christine Elliott's and et cetera will moderate him and control him. Well, they don't have any say in anything that's going on. And he sent Caroline Mulroney out to defend the lawsuit against the federal government, which she was clearly uncomfortable with doing. The education minister apparently refuses to answer questions about the curriculum for some weeks on end now. This is everybody who deals with government is scrambling right now not to figure out what Christine Elliott thinks or Rod Phillips thinks or Caroline Mulroney thinks. Everybody's trying to figure out, what does Doug Ford think and how do we get to Doug Ford? Because he's clearly driving the government in a very, very personal way. And he isn't a traditional conservative. You can't look at historical conservative positions and say, well, this is where he's likely to go. He's a populist. And if I could answer David Reevely's question, populism doesn't care about climate change because populism is anti-intellectual. And so populism doesn't believe that climate change exists. Populism has an easy answer to social assistance and welfare rates.
His environment minister has pretty clearly said on many occasions, we believe climate change is a real thing, we believe it's caused by people, and we will have a policy on it. Stay tuned.
Right, and I'll bet anybody in this panel any amount of money that whatever they produce, no commentator of any quality thinks it will make any difference to the climate and the planet.
As big as, say, shutting down all the gas plants.
Right.
Or the coal plants, forgive me, the coal plants. Yeah,
right.
Coal plants.
They're not going to have a serious, they will have a fake leaf climate change plan, not an actual climate change.
I always get nervous when I hear that word fake, because it's usually followed by news, and I think that's a bad word.
I meant to say fig leaf if I didn't.
Fig, okay.
Fig leaf.
Fig leaf, good.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying. Andrea Horwath has used some fairly tough talk when discussing this current premier. She says he's behaving like a dictator, like he thinks he's the king of Ontario. Is that appropriate?
Yes.
How come?
Because there's a lot of people that believe that he is behaving that way. When you take a look at what he's doing to the City of Toronto in particular with the council makeup, the number of wards, the number of councillors on that, there is a hypocrisy when Mr. Ford walks out and says that he is going to tear down the curriculum because not enough people were consulted. After 4,000 individuals were consulted on the revised sex ed curriculum, and that he turns around and says, we're going to cut the city council in the city of Toronto in half without any consultation whatsoever. That is at the heart of it. I'm a resident of the city of Toronto, and to be quite honest, while I was looking at these upcoming municipal elections with some fading interest, but nothing too serious until that, and then you realize that this is going to be a front with an effort against the provincial government that you didn't think we'd have to undertake. Particularly, what is egregious is that the campaign was already on, and that really, I think that affects people. It's not just about how many politicians there are. That's the populism that he's describing. This is about how the city is governed, how long it will take to get issues in the city dealt with, and it cuts right to the core of it all. And when somebody just says that I will cut without any consultation whatsoever, he is behaving anti-democratic, undemocratic, and that gets people, I think, fired up.
I think in many respects that's the most disturbing thing he's done, and not because I care how many councillors there are. I don't care how many councillors there are, and not because it is more important than a lot of the other things he's done, like cap and trade, et cetera, because it isn't. But it's an area in which he appeared to use the power of the state to advance personal agendas.
What was the personal agenda?
His personal agenda was his feuds with council in Toronto and with Patrick Brown trying to seek a regional chair position in Brampton. And that really is dangerous, almost Trumpian type territory where you feel that you've got the ability to use the levers of the state to settle scores or to advance personal agendas as opposed to a provincial agenda. So I don't really care about the substance of that issue, but his motivation is very disturbing to me.
Melissa, I need you to speak to this in a number of different angles here. So let's start with this. Marcus G., for example, in the Globe and Mail, said that Doug Ford's trimming of Toronto City Council and eliminating the chairmanship elections for the 4 districts/regions was personal and vindictive. Would you try to convince people that it wasn't?
Look, I think that there is a very small number of people advocating for more politicians, more councillors at City Hall. Those people happen to have a loud voice, but they are small in number. There aren't a lot of people that are going to tell you we actually need more politicians. We need to spend money.
I understand that's the frame that Premier Ford tried to put around this thing, but that was never what the issue was about, whether it's more or fewer politicians. It was about how he did this.
I find the timing obviously curious, but Doug Ford wasn't Premier 5 months ago. And then that's the simple truth. So doing this when he did it, it was actually the first opportunity. And again, not going to sit here and advocate for more politicians on councillors. They're in line with the province and the feds, and we'll see how it goes.
Small-minded people like me try to find consistency in political decisions. So I'm trying to see the consistency of requiring consultation with tens of thousands of people in order to get the appropriate sex ed position in place versus zero consultation with zero people in the middle of an election campaign to change the rules around a municipal situation.
I don't know what the thinking is, but in terms of the substance of the issue, I don't know how many council seats is the right number of council seats, but if it's not 47, it could be 45, it could be 25. We'll wait and see.
How are you reading all this?
Yeah.
That was a big exhale.
That one really threw me. I was really surprised at that particular decision and the timing. The timing, I think, is really the most fundamental part about it. People had already started spending money on campaigns and putting in efforts to run campaigns. And, I think that I would disagree that I think that there's going to be a certain amount of money spent on people helping the people within the community of Toronto. It might not be a councillor. If there aren't councillors there, then they're going to need more people to help deal with all the issues. 100,000 people is a lot of people for one person to serve. So I think that I would agree it looks highly suspicious in terms of whether it may in fact be a personal
Brad,
issue.
See if you'll meet me halfway on this. Would you agree that there are some issues that you know are going to be so fraught that actually just sort of dropping it on people, as opposed to having a year of hearings and so on and so forth, is the way to go? Are there any circumstances where that's okay?
Rip the Band-Aid off, so to speak.
Right.
Well, you can be effective to rip the Band-Aid off. Again, the provincial. We'll see what the legal situation is with Mr. Ford's decision to do that in the middle of an election campaign. Certainly, as a practitioner in politics and advisors to government, you can say that if you do something quickly, that you can get it done. But that doesn't make it right, particularly when this has all of the ringing that this is a personal vendetta. So it concerns a lot of people. The city of Toronto has taken such a beating in the last handful of decades, right? Mr. Harris started all this with the downloading of services and costs without the financial levers. You can see it every time you drive. Try to take the TTC, and here we are, barely scraping by. World-class city with all the problems that it has, and then now it gets dumped on again. And it's just no way to build up that city, and it's no way to build up the province. If Mr. Ford was consistent, then he would cut the politicians in every municipality. Yet he was just up at the Association of Ontario Municipalities conference in Ottawa a short while ago saying, don't worry, this is just Toronto.
For now.
For now.
Is what he said, I think, didn't he?
So
he added those words.
So if
for now.
I were in Ottawa or London or Windsor, I would not breathe a sigh of relief. Mr. Ford, if he can come after Toronto, he can come after you as well.
Okay, let's do some brass knuckles politics here. The Ontario government.
What have we been doing?
Good point. This one is going to have absolutely nothing to do with policy, though, as I think some of the discussion has so far. This is going to be focused strictly on politics. The Conservative government has announced that it is taking the federal government to court on the carbon tax stuff. It has, as we have just described, kind of launched a full-scale fusillade against Toronto City Council. So one fight with the government up here, another fight with the government down here. Does it, and of course the federal government is Liberal and the City Council government is...
Dysfunctional.
Well, okay, you want to describe that. I was going to look for a partisan term, but dysfunctional, you might not get disagreement from a lot of people on that. My question, David, to you first on this, does it serve the Ontario Progressive Conservative government's political interests to be fighting with Liberals federally and with Progressives on Toronto City Council?
I don't really understand the strategy behind the fight with council. That doesn't mean there isn't one or that there couldn't be one. I just don't know what it is or what the politics of that would be. I think my sense is that they have, on that front, alienated more people than they needed to, because it doesn't make a lot of sense the way that they've proceeded. And so they're probably, you can normally look at it and say, well, those are progressives and they never vote for us anyway. I think in this case, they've probably got more than just a hard progressive vote looking askance at what they've done with City Council. With the feds, I think there's more obvious strategy. I mean, we're headed for a year of this, right? Now, with the elimination of the cap and trade program in Ontario, you face the imposition of a federal carbon tax on Jan 1, 2019.
If it's legal.
A federal election year. Yes, if it's legal. Most legal experts, around the same percentage who believe climate change exists, the same percentage of legal experts think that the federal carbon tax is legal and will proceed. But that will obviously dominate politics in Ontario over the course of 2019, leading up to the federal election. And frankly, I would expect Doug Ford to be a more formidable opponent to the Trudeau government in 2019 than Andrew Scheer is. That will be to the benefit of Andrew Scheer, but it will be a knockdown, drag-him-out fight between Trudeau and Ford, all through 2019, in my view.
Which, Melissa, is why I asked the question in the first place. Is it good politics for Doug Ford to have picked a fight on such a high-profile issue with Justin Trudeau on the one hand, and with, I'm going to say it, John Tory, the former Progressive Conservative Party leader of Ontario, and a lot of the progressive downtown politicians on the other hand?
So I think we'll touch City Council first, and I think that you're vastly exaggerating how many people this actually affects. We saw polling saying most Torontonians agree that we should have a smaller council.
Which
so I'm
poll?
not sure.
Which poll said that?
Our friends at Navigator put out a poll that had most Torontonians actually agreeing with a reduced size in City Council. So it sort of depends where you hang out. On the federal side. I actually think that it's politically smart to pick a fight on this one. If we have another election about a carbon tax, well, we just saw what happened in Ontario on a very real pocketbook issue, and the carbon tax is very much the same. And I think that you have some friends, new premier probably coming in Alberta, who is also, Mr. Kenney, who is also vehemently opposed to the carbon tax. You have a friend in Saskatchewan who also wants to pick that fight. I'm not sure that Manitoba won't come around, and a couple of our eastern provinces might very well feel the same thing. So now you have a building coalition of people that don't want this, that don't want a carbon tax in their provinces. And if we see a federal election on it, it might be an issue to watch.
Brad, if the courts ultimately decide that the carbon tax is legal, as most legal experts say that it is, and that Ontario has in fact wasted $30 million to fight this thing, how's that going to look?
Well, it's going to look futile. And I agree that most legal experts are saying that Ottawa is within its right to have this. So we will have a price on carbon in Ontario on January 2, 2019. It'll either be the one that we had under the Ontario government, or we'll have the one under the federal government. And that's the same case in the province of Alberta if there is a change. But I would not write off Rachel Notley at this stage. There's a long way to go. In terms of whether it's good politics, it certainly is to pick a fight with Ottawa if you're Queen's Park and you're of a different political stripe. I don't know how much juice you can get, but in the first 67 days of his mandate, I hear Doug Ford on far too many news reports. I hear him when we talk about the carbon tax and the issue that Ottawa is dealing with. He's in that story. When we talk about the municipal election, he's in that story. And then when we talk about provincial politics, he's in that story. He's in all three stories, which is very, that's good from a PR. As a practitioner, I will salute these guys for having their leader, their premier, in a whole bunch of pies. The question is, at what point does it run out? At what point do you start turning people off? That is, those people, not the hardcore supporters, they'll always be with you, but those that are on the margins that may have voted because they wanted to change, they weren't ready for Andrew Horwath, so they said, well, Elliott and Mulroney will keep him honest. Let's put our thing in there. If he goes too strong against Ottawa, those are a lot of the same voters. PC in Ontario, Liberal federally. If he goes too hard on them on the wrong issue, he could alienate them and help Trudeau. As I was saying after the provincial election, the happiest person in the country that Doug Ford got elected was Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, I've heard you say that.
Yes.
And I guess the Maxime Bernier stuff just adds to that.
That's a whole other episode.
That is a whole other episode. Okay. Yeah, just before we leave this, let me get your take on, as a Green Party candidate and as somebody who is, I guess, watching issues now from a financial point of view, you're the finance critic, how do you hope this whole fight over carbon pricing works itself out?
I am...
Because your leader, sorry, I should just add, your leader was also against cap and trade.
Right, yeah.
Your leader also wanted to phase out cap and trade.
He would have preferred a carbon fee and dividend system where when we collect a carbon-related fee, we redistribute it to the people of Ontario so that the people who are potentially most affected by the effects of climate change, those living in poverty, aren't negatively affected by the pricing.
So how do you hope this all works itself out?
I do really hope that what I'm hearing from all of the experts, that's true, that there will be, in fact, a carbon pricing scheme coming into effect in January.
From the Ontario government?
I would be happy with it either way. I think that it is really costly for us to have put in place this particular system and then trying to switch. We know that many businesses spent almost $3 billion in buying what is now considered worthless credits. Right. And the proposal from the government at this point is to provide them $5 million. I imagine that there is going to be more lawsuits to follow that we haven't heard about
Well,
yet.
let me pick up on that. And we've got, what do we got? Just a few minutes left here, and I'm going to, let's finish up on this.
I wish you'd been more passionate. I wish you'd been more passionate. This year, the battle for the world is on. If these provincial governments succeed in beating Trudeau over the carbon tax and elect a Conservative government in Ottawa, then there is no chance Canada will meet its commitments to Paris, none whatsoever, and we will be part of the most disgraceful thing that humanity's ever done.
I would be impressed if we could meet those targets even with the carbon tax plans that we have in place.
Okay, again, with just a few minutes to go, you have heard this criticism of Ford already, which is they make policy by saying ready, fire, aim.
Right.
And Tesla was a great example of the government just sort of deciding that they're going to end this program, not realizing that what they were attempting was illegal. And the government not only found for Tesla, but told the government of Ontario, the court said, you got to pay their legal bills. There's 112 grand down the toilet. Does the government need to think harder about how it makes decisions?
Look, I think any government, we started the show saying Doug Ford's been premier for 67 days. So I think there's a lot of plans that haven't been laid yet. But of course, you've got to do the legwork. Legislating is a lot harder than election promises. And so far, we've seen some of those election promises come through. But if we want to go back to the carbon tax, and we're talking about fighting a federal election on the carbon tax, remember, Doug Ford has his majority because of commuters in the 905 who are feeling that, and because we're here on a panel talking about climate change, and I don't think it's not important, but I think there's a lot of pocketbook issues. There's a lot of I'm working harder and I'm not getting ahead type of tone that isn't being addressed when we talk about sort of federally on the climate change issue or on Indigenous affairs or on gender equality. And not that those things aren't important, but they can't take they can't take the cake as the number one issue.
And that is our time. I want to thank all of you for coming in tonight, helping us inaugurate season 13 here on the agenda. Melissa Lunsman at Hill and Knowlton, David Hurley from the Gandalf Group, Brad Levine from Council Public Affairs, Stacey Dankert, who speaks for the Green Party on issues, financial, and others. Thanks so much, everybody. Great to have you here on TVO tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.